that you guys showed up. I know it's hard when we have a week off, take a break, and get momentum going, and get 3 in a row, and then take a break for first trade last week. So back there, 2 more tonight and next week. And I don't know how you're coming into tonight, what's been going on in your life. I got a chance to go to my hometown this last weekend. Went up on Thursday to go see my family in Richmond, eat dinner with them, see my nieces, and then Friday went and spent 2 nights with childhood friends that we get to try to get together once every year. We've done this now for, I think this is our 8th or 9th year. And so we went just outside of Charlottesville, Waynesboro area near a place called Wintergreen, and enjoyed. There was a woman who had a family member of one of the guys, but she has a couple cabins out there, and she graciously let us use them, and we got to spend time together. We got to go hiking. The weather was beautiful. Just the leaves were just like barely a couple of them starting to change, so kind of missed the fall foliage, but did not want to come back to the Florida humidity, but always excited to be back home and be with you guys. So there's also the last passion class going on right now, so that's exciting. This morning we had a staff meeting, and as part of that we took pictures. We have pictures of everyone who's in that class and held them up and shared what we knew about what God's doing in their lives and opportunities we've had with lunch and things with them. And so it's exciting to see folks who are finishing that class. Many of them will decide to join, and they'll be interviewed here. I think it could be, I don't think it's this weekend, I think it's the following weekend. Do you remember, Maggie, when? Soon. And then they're going to join. So we're excited about that. So you may have things that have gone on in your life in the last 2 weeks that you have been rejoicing over. Found out about a new adoption that's going to happen, and that's exciting for Sandra and Jenna. And there might be things that have been really difficult. Ray won't be here this weekend. Ray's mother passed away, and so she was 98, and so it was, knew that was coming, but did not know it was going to happen this weekend. And then, so you may have things like that. So however you're coming in tonight, maybe I'm going to pray, try to recenter us, focus us on our task at hand, and we'll look at this unit 4. So let's pray together. God, you are always at work in our lives, in the what we would call the good and the happy and the rejoicing moments, and you are at work in what we would call the sad and confusing and sorrowful moments. But you are always at work in our lives, and you are always working all things for our good, sovereignly, in your providence and in your wisdom. You are shaping us and forming us more and more into the image of your Son. You have redeemed us and renewed us. You have made us new creations. We are your adopted children. We are beloved, and we are holy and righteous in your sight. And so, Lord, we thank you that even as we come in tonight, we're reminded of truth that we can stake our present and our future on. It's truth that can speak to the things in our past that want to hold us down and drag us under. And so, Lord, we pray that you would give us grace and mercy tonight as we look at your word and as we take in your truth together. Would you open our minds and our eyes, and would you help our time together to be honoring and pleasing in your sight, and So we are on Unit 4, and we're looking at the issue of slavery and human trafficking in the Old Testament. And we use that language because some who would seek to discredit the Bible and say that it actually condones things like this would be people like the New Atheists, they were called back in the day, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. They said that when you read the Old Testament, and you look at the Old Testament God, what you find there is a warrant for trafficking in humans and treating people like farm equipment. Or you might think of someone who would say, well, the Bible clearly teaches slavery, and you see how that worked out for our American history, and we have to reckon with that, and the fact that we did have Christians in our country, particularly in the South, Bible believers who justified the institution of slavery, who continued similar justifications, through Jim Crow and all kinds of things like that, and racism that we've experienced. And so we need to be able to answer, well, what does the Bible say? Does it condone slavery and the treatment of people who are different? Does it give warrant for human trafficking in particular? And so we'll look at some passages and consider some things. Won't exhaust the topic. In fact, as I worked through this and tried to think about how to lay it out, there's way more that can be said. In fact, might send you later on this week some more stuff that I read that addresses particular passages in the Old Testament. We can't go over every single one, particularly difficult ones, but kind of maybe if we could get some big principles, wrap our minds around it, look at some things that'll be a good start. So first thing that we want to look at is we want to make sure that we consider the difference between what we would call chattel slavery versus debt servanthood. So most people, when you just say slavery, what comes to mind, what comes to mind for us is what we see, in our U.S. history and world history, more recent, with the African slave trade and slavery of that nature. We think of that would be called chattel slavery. But when you're looking at the Old Testament, there is what we're looking at is not chattel slavery. It's better called debt servanthood. So there's a mistake in associating this servanthood in the Old Testament with antebellum slavery in the South. What do we know was true about antebellum slavery, chattel slavery? You had slave traders, you had plantation owners, and these things were true in the ancient Near East too. But the underlying principles were things like the slave is your property, right? That the slave owner has rights over the slave's person and work that are total and absolute. That would be another distinction of what we call chattel slavery. And that the slave is therefore stripped of his or her identity. And so that's the kind of slavery that we tend to think of. But this is different than what the Bible is describing and giving laws about. We call what we find in the Old Testament not chattel slavery, but debt servanthood. And debt servanthood existed, as you can guess from the name, because poverty existed. And so an individual or a family or members from that family would enter voluntarily, or in the case of a family member, your father might choose this for you because of being in debt, because of poverty would themselves or for their families or others enter into this voluntary servanthood, right? And become a servant to another Israelite to pay off their debt. So they found themselves in poverty. There was no other way for them to get out, survive, and so one or all or some of the family members would go into this debt-servanthood relationship, and there were regulations around it. You could earn your freedom. You could earn money to essentially pay for your freedom, to pay off your debt in this situation. So you see how that's different from what we normally think of in chattel slavery, that is a lifelong kind of servitude. This person had the opportunity through their work to actually earn their way free. But not only that, there was a limitation to how long they could be in this relationship, how long they could be in this situation. They had to be released after 6 years. So every 7 years, debts were automatically canceled, and people were released from their servanthood. Every 50th year was called the year of Jubilee, and every 50th year, the land that would have been mortgaged out to pay for a debt situation would be restored to the original families. And so the difference between that and what you see in chattel slavery is clear, but even the difference between that and the ancient Near East, where it's basically the master's prerogative whether he wanted to let you go or not. But in the Old Testament, God's law, he had it set up that every 7 years, right, or after 7 years, you would be, after 6 years of service, in the 7th year, you would be set free, and every 50th year was the year of Jubilee when all things were restored. And when that happened, either when you earned your way or when you were released or by one of these points in time, you were returned to being a full participant in Israelite society. So it's a very different situation than what we just initially think of when we think of slavery. The laws that are given, as you read through the Old Testament, relating to, sometimes the word slave will be used. The word servant is probably the best, most accurate word, because what we're talking about. We're about controlling and regulating this situation. As we've said before, not idealizing it, because it is kind of a recognition of, the ideal is that there would be no poor in the land, but because there were, God gave laws to regulate and control how people were treated, to make sure that servants were treated well, that they were treated with dignity and respect. And not only that, but there were laws to protect the poor from getting into this situation in the first place. So there were laws to even attempt to hedge against someone getting into a place where they would have to put themselves into this debt servanthood. For example, things like gleaning the fields, right? That you're not to harvest all the way to your edges, but you're to leave some, right? And let people glean behind you. That was for the poor, so that they wouldn't have to go into this situation. The Israelites were commanded to lend freely to their fellow Israelites without interest. Right? They could lend with interest to non-Israelites, but to their own people, they were not to lend with interest, so that someone would not fall into this perpetual cycle of debt and have to become someone's servant. And there were things like alternative sacrifices for the poor. So if you were poor and you wanted to offer a sacrifice, you couldn't afford the best sacrifice, the lamb without blemish, the heifer, or whatever. That there were other options, lesser options, cheaper options, right? Doves and pigeons and things that were acceptable for you. And so all of these, there were laws to kind of hedge against and protect this from even happening. And then when it did happen, there were laws to make sure that it was regulated, controlled, that people were not abused, that they were released after so many years, and brought back into Israelite society. So just to kind of lay out that this is what we're talking about in the Old Testament is very different from what we think of in more recent history and what existed in the ancient Near East in other cultures. So I want you to see this in the Bible, and so if you look page 23 of your notes, you see there Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 18. And I would love for you to read that with someone, or in a little group or something, and read through those 18 verses and just make some observations, underline stuff, circle things. What stands out to you that shows you these things that we're talking about, that shows the particular provisions and expectations that God had for these scenarios? So go through those 18 verses. Take a little bit of time here, and then I'll have you guys call out some things that you have observed. Okay, so what stood out to you? What did you notice? What observations did you have? Oh, yes, ma'am. Yeah, she said they could stay if they wanted to, and I don't understand. I haven't looked into deeply into what that's about, the whole awl and putting it through the ear and the door and that stuff. But yeah, there was provision for if this servant found that this was actually a very amenable situation and they loved the family, they wanted to stay with them and felt like it provided for their own family, and that there was provision for that to continue. And so it just feels very different than um, you know, the chattel slavery situation. Yes, sir.
I was thinking that was possibly a metaphor for what they did with this, how they reinitiated the servitude or whatever it was. It was a metaphor, not an act of physical.
Oh, the whatever they did with the ear. Yeah, yeah.
I was just looking at that. It was a ritual.
Ritual.
Yeah, they pierced their ear with an awl in front of witnesses, essentially proclaim that they're now a member of the family.
Pierce their ear in front of witnesses.
Yeah, that's where.
What in your study Bible or whatever you have says, yeah.
And it was what was confusing to me was they're still called slaves after that ritual.
Yeah, they kind of. It's not like they're adopted into the family, but the relationship still stays the same. But they're committing to. So if you ever wondered, what does the Bible say about earrings? And maybe this is a. Yes, sir.
7 years, end of every 7 years. Where is that 7 years measured from? Is it different for each family, or is there a 7-year?
Yeah, I think, and I could be wrong about this, Destiny, in 7 years, how is it measured? I think it's from when you become, so it's not like there is some, looks like some sort of lending at like every 7th year that it's, because there's this language of, if you know the 7th year is coming, don't withhold because you know you're not going to get it back. But I think there's also some expectation that when you indenture yourself, that it is for maybe up to 7 years. So I'm not sure how those two things go together. I know that there's like a calendar that the Israelites followed, and then the 50th year was the year of Jubilee. But
If you're a slave, then you're counting 7 years.
yeah, you know that is coming. You're right. You're looking forward to that for sure.
I read that to mean if you lend, then there's like the year of Jubilee is every 50 years, so every 7 years there's a release.
Mm-hmm.
So if you lend, then it's based on that. If a brother or a sister Hebrew is sold to you, then they work for you, and on that 7th year they are released.
Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure how. I'd have to get into it more to see how does this work with when you start on where in the and how that works. But the point is that there was consistent expectation that like this was not a perpetual thing, right? Consistent expectation that people would be released from this situation and set free. That was not just based on the whim of the master or their inability to pay it off, and they would stay indebted forever.
What impressed me starting off was all the Lord your God, the Lord will bless, the Lord will bless, this whole thing.
Yeah. The Lord there, the covenant name for God is used there, Lord Yahweh, yeah.
So you have the blessing, he will bless. How many times is that mentioned?
Yep. Very good, yes, sir.
Was there any enforcement to this procedure? Was there? Everybody didn't do this. I assume there were the people who said, well, not for me.
Yeah, his question is, was there an enforcement to this? And I think that was part of there were religious.
Right, I understand.
I don't know if that was the role of the priests, but there were other, I think it was all regulated, enforced, yeah.
So there was some punitive thing. If
yeah, I mean, to the degree that Israel actually did it, God got mad at them very often in the Old Testament because they didn't do these things. And so the laws were put out there, but very often they didn't follow. They oppressed the poor. They did not treat their servants well, and that made God very angry. And so, what do you think?
There seems to be a distinction between a brother and a foreigner.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, and yeah, because it said, don't, where was it? There's a distinction made between a brother and a foreigner, and yes, we'll see that. There's a distinction made between someone who's an Israelite and someone who's a Gentile or not.
Which kind of goes down to almost the last line. You shall not borrow, and you shall not rule over many nations, but they shall not rule. You shall rule over many nations, but they shall not rule over you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the
Verse 6.
being a foreigner.
Yes, yeah, that's referring to other nations, non-Israelites, foreigners. Yes, close to the back.
Brandon, I like it how when you cut them loose at year 7, you don't just say, see ya. You give them flocks, you give them food, you give them provisions. I mean, that never happened in the antebellum South.
Right, yeah, if you were to let a slave go, or if you think of even something like incarceration situation today, like why do people so often go back to that? Because they get out and they have nothing, right? And so you could have done that. You're free, go on and fall right back into this indebtedness. But instead, yeah, I love what he says there. You shall not let him go empty-handed. That's verse 14. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. So yeah, it's very different from what we see in other scenarios. Yes, sir.
The term servant, does that translate as employee?
The term servant, I don't know, I would have to look at in the Hebrew. I do remember reading an illustration that said, it really is more appropriate to think of this, even when the Old Testament uses language of buying and selling and I don't know if it's just trading, but that kind of language of buying and selling, that it said the best illustration would be to think of it like that sounds very inhumane, but think of it like a sports team. And they buy and sell and move around players to the different teams. It's not saying anything about how those players are treated or that they're necessarily property. It's just the kind of relationship that they're in, right? This economic relationship that they're in. And so they are owned by the team, but not to be mistreated by them. Connie, did you have something?
I was just going to say it's interesting that you're guilty of sin if you don't lend to your brother.
Yeah, it's very clear there. Guilty of sin to not lend to your brother. Gary,
Yeah, I was just taking a look. The passage refers to you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, which is chattel slavery.
That's good. Yeah, we're going to.
Right within the text as it's showing.
Yes, yeah, we'll look at another verse like that. But you shall remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the slavery that they experienced there was different, right? It's kind of like, don't do that. Don't treat your servants like you were treated in Egypt. You were treated harshly, right? You weren't there voluntarily. You were forced slavery. Yes, sir.
There wasn't just debt servanthood, though, in Israel. I mean, when they had wars, it was customary to bring people back
Yes.
who were actual slaves.
Yes.
So
Yep.
I'm assuming they would be treated as chattel slavery even within Israel.
We'll look at that. He's asking. There were like prisoners of war and people brought back from war, and how were they treated? Were they treated more like property? And yeah, we'll look at some of that. Anything else? And we looked at we looked at that in the context of POWs 2 weeks ago, didn't we? We talked about that a little bit too, about how prisoners of war was that in the context of women? Women prisoners of war. That was interesting to see. And the one where if the man wanted to marry her, how he had to give a month or something and make sure, and yeah. Okay, let's keep going. This good. It's not the only, not at all, not the only section in the Old Testament that addresses these things. We'll look at some more, and like I said, we won't look at all of them, but that's a good one to highlight the difference between what we're talking about here. And so what's a big theological truth behind this? A creational ideal. We've been talking about that, about how God is seeking to base off of the ideals of creation and moving towards the ideal of how the new creation in Christ, this incremental change that we see happening in the Bible. The original creational ideal was the ideal of the imago Dei, right? That people are made in the image of God. And the reason this is significant is because when you get the Old Testament laws, as opposed to some of the ancient Near East laws, the Code of Hammurabi and others, this is the first time in the ancient Near East where servants are to be treated as persons and not property, right? That they're to be treated with dignity and rights because they are human beings. In other cultures, it was the king who was made in the image of God. But the Bible says that all people are made in the image of God. So you see Genesis 1:27 there, right? The creational ideal there. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And so being made in the image of God has implications for how we treat people, even if they're in an economic relationship of servanthood. It is to affect the way that people are to be treated. And so in Job 31, you get this, where he says, if I had denied justice to any of my servants, whether male or female, when they had a grievance against me, what will I do when God confronts me? What will I answer when called to account? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one form us both within our mothers? So you see there, this is not because I'm that he or she is a lesser human being than I am, which is what has been used throughout history, right, to subjugate people and put them in slavery and traffic them, is that you're lesser than, you're somehow subhuman. And so the ideal here is and how this debt servanthood work was. It was not based on racism, right? This was not an ethnic thing. This was not because we're somehow different. And so that's important to note and to see, and it's important to continue to affirm, right, as we go through history, that all people, it's part of our founding documents, right, as a nation, that we're made in the image of God, that we have equal dignity, value, and worth simply by the fact that we are created in his image, no matter our skin color or socioeconomic class or situation that we find ourselves in. So I want to show you 3 clear laws that are in the Old Testament that were written to, like I said, regulate and control this situation, that were distinct to Israel. So these were distinct in the ancient Near East. And here's the reality. If these had been followed by people who were claiming to be Bible-believing Christians in the South, right, in the U.S. South, prior to the Civil War and during and after, if these were followed, then we would not have had slavery. If these 3 clear laws were seen and actually followed, then you wouldn't have, it would actually undercut the whole institution of slavery, and eventually did. But here are the 3 clear laws that we see that God gives. First is the release of injured servants. So Exodus 21, 26, and 27 says, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. There's more in here that we could talk about, but here's the big principle, which is unique to Israel and distinct at that time, which is that masters were held accountable for how they treated their servants. So you could, as opposed to, I'm just going to beat my servant, going to injure them, harm them, and in the ancient Near East, it was actually the owner who was then worried about and compensated, and the law seemed to want to protect, not the slave or the servant who was actually beaten. And so here you have the opposite, right? That if you mistreat your slave, you have to let them go, because that's not how you're to treat them. So this was unparalleled in the ancient Near East. That masters were held accountable for how they treated their servants. That's what I want you to see there. We could dive deeper into that passage and figure out, well, why would he be striking him? Why would he be knocking him? That would lead to that. But the idea is there that this is different from what was going on around in other cultures. The second one is anti-kidnapping laws. So, again, Exodus 21, verse 16, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Deuteronomy 24:7, if a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. This is a very clear repudiation in the Old Testament of any kind of trafficking of human beings. And so, when you think of like the Africa slave trade and the people going and pillaging, right, and taking people from their homeland to go place them elsewhere and have them work. The Bible is very clear. This is a sin punishable by death, to kidnap someone and sell them as a slave. Not to do that. And then the third very clear law is helping runaway slaves. So Deuteronomy 23:15 through 16, you shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him. So you can imagine a situation in which either a slave from another culture, from a non-Israelite culture, or maybe a servant within an Israelite servant that's being harshly treated by their master, right? Running from that and wanting to escape that harsh treatment. And so the law here is that you don't send him back, right? You don't send her back. You care for them, right? You let them dwell with you. You don't wrong them, which is the exact opposite of the Confederate South's fugitive slave law, which legally required runaway slaves to be returned to their owners. And in the ancient Near East, Hammurabi said that anyone helping a runaway slave would be put to death. So you see just the stark difference there, right? Put to death if you help them, commanded, right, not to send them back. In the ancient Near East, when slaves were returned, they were often disfigured. Right? Their ears were slit or they were branded so that everyone knew that they had been a runaway. So there's three very clear laws. There are other things, like I said in there, that are not passage, not as clear, not as easy to deal with. But just these three, if these three things had been clearly understood and seen in the U.S. history, we would not have of slavery because it goes against all three of those things. And Paul Copen writes in his book, in talking about this, he said, based on all these things, if you had to choose between servanthood in Israel and slavery in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, the same person would pick Israel every time. So what he's wanting to show there is that Israel has existed in that period of time, in that ancient Near East. The laws and the culture that God created them to have was, distinct and morally better than, not because they were better, but because his laws created a much more just and God-honoring, image-bearing, honoring system than what was around them at the time. Questions about that? Yes, ma'am.
How does that fit in with Philemon and Onesimus?
We're going to get there. So how does that fit in with Philemon and Onesimus, the New Testament, and particularly the idea of sending someone back? Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, let's look at. This was helpful to me. This distinction that you will see when you read the Old Testament between these categories. You'll hear this language of strangers, sojourners, aliens, and foreigners. And that's actually not 4 different groups of people. It's actually 2. Strangers, sojourners, and aliens, or resident aliens, those all kind of one right there. Talking about the same person. Foreigners is the second group of people. So you've got foreigners, and then you've got these 3 words are used to describe the same person: stranger, sojourner, alien. We saw this verse in the Deuteronomy passage. It's reiterated right there in Exodus 23:9. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. What is the distinction between a stranger or sojourner or alien and a foreigner? The stranger or the sojourner or the resident alien was an acquired servant who sought to follow Israel's rules and Israel's God. Someone who came from the outside. They were not an Israelite, but they came and they said, I will follow Israel's rules and I will follow Israel's God. And we have a great biblical example of that. Who is that? Ruth. Yeah? Ruth, who says to Naomi, I will go back with you. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. So she would be a sojourner or a stranger, a resident alien. She's not part of she's not an ethnic Israelite, but she is taking that on and following the Lord. Now, a foreigner, that it often in the English translated foreigner, the Hebrew says, there's different words. Foreigner is someone also outside the people of God, a Gentile, but they refused to follow Israel's rules and follow Israel's God. So the one person said, I want to worship the Lord and I want to play by the rules. The other person said, no, I refuse to do that. And the reason a foreigner would be in the land would be perhaps economic. They would be there trading. They would be there selling. They would have been brought there through some sort of war or something. So you had people coming into Israel who then responded differently to God and either agreeing or not agreeing to the rules and to following him. Here's the thing, though, is that when you read in the Old Testament, both the stranger, the sojourner, the alien, both that person and the foreigner were to be treated with dignity and respect. there were different benefits that came. If you were going to be like a Ruth and say, your God will be my God, and then there were benefits that came to you because of that, and there were benefits that you did not have access to if you were going to be a foreigner and refuse. But still, both were still to be treated with dignity and respect, and were treated way better than would have been treated in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. And so God, as you read through, you'll see God's expressing, you're to care for the foreigner, you're to care for the sojourner, and so here's like a really pertinent and an illustration that we can understand, right? It's not an exact thing, but it makes sense to us, which is think about immigration, right, in our country. And so you have people who will come into a country, in the case of the United States, let's say they come across the U.S.-Mexico border and they come across illegally, right? And they're saying, I'm not playing by the rules, I'm coming in, and so that would be an example of a foreigner, right? Then you have other folks who are saying, I'll play by the rules, right? I'll kind of wait my turn, I'll go through the process, and yet God is saying, treat both people with dignity and respect, right? Our tendency is to say, hey, follow the rules, follow the laws, we'll treat those people well, but the people who are, streaming over the border illegally, we'll treat them harshly. But rather, God's saying in this context in Israel, and you're to treat both groups with dignity and respect. Like, still, there are going to be benefits for those who do it the right way, right? And those who do it illegally, and those who don't adopt don't get those benefits. But yet, both are still made in the image of God and are to be treated in a God-honoring way. So, there should be ways. This is getting into our politics stuff, but there should be ways, even for the church in a situation like that, to be able to care for both groups, right? To be able to not just care for those who are following the law and doing it the right way, but having compassion, understanding for those who are doing it the wrong way, and that's not speaking to anything that they should then, therefore, jump the line ahead of others, but still caring for them, right? Helping them get representation and things like that. So you see how really practical this is and how it plays out in the life of Israel. And the ideal was that someone would move from being a foreigner to a sojourner, right? That they would. So you see that in Isaiah 56:3, where it says, "Let not the foreigner who's joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people." The ideal was that the foreigner would come in, right? That was the movement of the Bible, was that the nations would come and would be part of God's people, and so foreigners would move, would become sojourners, would become followers of God. And so we see this movement into the New Testament and beyond. So by the time you get to the New Testament, you have this Old Testament background, and you have this Israelite practice and these laws. But in the time of the New Testament with Rome, you start to get closer to what we would call a chattel slavery. Still not the same, still not an equal one-to-one, more of a blend. And so even when you're arguing, looking at the New Testament, they'll say, well, look, the New Testament, slavery or whatever, still not the same as what we see in our U.S. history, but moving closer to that than what it was in the Old Testament. In fact, I was reading 90% of the Roman population in the 1st century AD was in some sort of indentured servitude or slavery. A lot, huge percentage. And so you have this background where you have these you think of these laws, these categories of foreigners and sojourners, and expectations for how people would be treated, and you come to the New Testament and look at some of the scriptures. I put them there on page 27 that we find. Sometimes the question is didn't Jesus, why didn't Paul, why didn't Peter, right? Why didn't they just come out and say, like, slavery's wrong, we're going to end slavery, it should be abolished right now. For a similar reason that you see in the Old Testament, right? This progressive movement towards the ideal, that to do something that huge and disruptive would have probably distracted from the gospel message and from what was and where it was moving. So what you see in the New Testament is not an abolishing outright of slavery, but this continual movement towards its abolishment and towards the ideal. And so, for example, Luke 4 it says when Jesus comes to the temple, the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." That's that language of that every seventh year, and in particular at that year of Jubilee, right? Jesus comes and says it's the year of Jubilee. And so those who are oppressed and those who are in captivity are going to be set free. And so you see that language from Jesus there. In Acts 2, referencing Joel, you see when on the day of Pentecost, Peter stands up and says, "This is what was uttered through the prophet Joel. In the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my male servants and female servants, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy." So you see there's picking up of the prophecy from Joel and saying these are the days now when people are like, no matter what their situation, they all receive the Spirit of God, and therefore they're all at an equal footing before the Lord. Galatians 3:28 emphasizes this, right? Paul says there's neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. It's really interesting. I had never seen this before, but in 1 Timothy 1, 8 through 11, you have Paul listing off examples of disobedience and ungodliness, and almost, this is what I had never noticed before, this person pointed out that it's a comment on the Ten Commandments. You can kind of see a reference to the Ten Commandments in here as he says, but look at what he includes in there. "We know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, and then enslavers, liars, perjurers, whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I've been entrusted." Enslavers there, right? Paul very clearly puts in the same category with all of these other examples of lawlessness and disobedience and ungodliness and sin, those who would enslave others, those who would, and he's following the Old Testament example, right? Those who would seek to kidnap and sell others. And then he gives this admonition to slaves and servants in 1 Corinthians 7. "Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity." Right? If you're able to gain your freedom, then do so. "For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain with God." So you can see the New Testament moving in the direction of abolition, moving in the direction of the ending of slavery, not doing it so in such a revolutionary way that it completely upsets, the entire Roman Empire and, throws the Christians into, tons of persecution and overrides the message. But you see it there, right, progressing in the New Testament. And so it's not a surprise that, and with Onesimus and Paul, there's some debate on why Paul has him return, but the emphasis is on you're to receive him back as a brother, right? You're not to treat him as a slave or servant anymore, but as a brother. And so this just movement in the Old Testament, from Old Testament to New Testament, to then it's not surprising that as the Christian faith spread into Europe after the fall of Rome, that the practice of slavery dwindled. Slavery virtually died out in Europe by the Middle Ages, when Europe had become Christianized. Now slavery reappeared again, but it was strongly opposed by those dedicated believers in groups like the Mennonites and the Quakers, Christian leaders like Richard Baxter and John Wesley and William Wilberforce, the name you're probably familiar with. And so Christianity has always had this trajectory, this movement toward abolition, toward the ending of slavery, because it's based on these ideals of people being made in the image of God, being treated with dignity and respect, and being, fully brought in to the people of God, no matter what their ethnicity or background. So I'm going to talk about maybe an application for today, show you a video. Any questions before I do that? Yeah, so the language of you were slave to sin or bondservant to sin. That's used in the New Testament to capture that sin was your master. And now it is interesting. There is even Paul will say that we were once slaves to sin, we've now become slaves or bondservants to Christ. But even with that, the majority language of the New Testament is that of is not that of you are in that sense where Jesus is your master, but he also, Jesus says, no longer call you servants but friends, right? And this in this picture of freedom, and now you're part of the family, and is much more than that language of slavery and servanthood. Other thoughts or questions before I give you a little application and I want to show you a video? Okay, so here's I think what should we do with this? How do we apply this today? I mean, there certainly is human trafficking in the world today. There certainly still exists slavery in the world today, and with every fiber of our redeemed being, right, new creation hearts, we should fight against that. We should desire to see that come to an end. We should also just, think through, I think, when you're a Christian, you have this global perspective, this kingdom-minded perspective to the world, but you also, I think, have to account for what does it mean that I'm a Christian in my particular context, right? That I'm a Christian in 2025 in the United States of America, that I'm an American Christian, I think means to be honest and deal with ways in which those who came before us in our country fell short of these ideals that were put forth. Like we said, if these things had been actually followed, we wouldn't have the kind of the history that we have. And to be honest about that, not to kind of poo-poo on our country, but rather just to actually see it be what we would would hope that it would be. And so it's good when we realize that there are connections from these things, that even though the institution of slavery no longer exists, even though we had the civil rights movement, right? There still exists racism in our world today, right? There's still people who are treated not as fairly or treated poorly because of the color of their skin, and so that vision, right, of wanting to see all people seen in the image of God, and so it's so good for us, even as a church. We went on a family mission trip a couple years ago, and we went to Montgomery, Alabama. And as you know, the civil rights movement was so centered there in Montgomery. You had the bus boycott. You had Martin Luther King's church that he preached at there. So much rich history there. So many examples of injustice, and so we went there as a family mission trip. We took our kids, all the families that were with us. We got to do some really great things. If you get a chance to go to Montgomery, you should go to the museum that's there. There's a museum. There are memorials that are created by, and they were part of the ideal from Brian Stevenson, who is a lawyer who wrote a book called Just Mercy, and in which he was fighting for people, African Americans on death row who did not have representation, who were actually innocent, and getting them set free from prison, right, and from not having to be executed. And so I want to show you, there's a video. This is just like the homepage video for this. So if maybe sparks an interest in you, you want to go and learn more about the history of our country, see what it was really powerful. It's powerful for my own kids and the kids that were on the trip. And so I'll show you, this is the video that's on their homepage it's called the Legacy Museum. And the voice you'll hear is that of Brian Stevenson. And so watch this video, and then I'll close with some prayer, and then we'll be done tonight. All right? It's like a 3-minute video.
We believe there's important work that has to be done in this country to fully overcome the history and legacy of slavery. It's important that we begin to commit to an era of truth and justice, that we tell the truth about our history, that we find the words necessary to understand all of the pain, all of the suffering that was created by 400 years of enslavement, lynching, segregation, and injustice. It begins in Africa, where millions of people were kidnapped, abducted, taken from their homes, taken from their families, chained, forced onto ships where they were displaced forever. Without understanding that legacy, we don't appreciate the harm, the damage, the tragedy that surrounded the founding of this country. We still live in a country where there is this problem of racial inequality, racial injustice, and the narrative that created that problem of racial difference continues to haunt us today. And so this museum is dedicated to helping people understand the journey. We want people to understand the suffering that slavery created. The demographic geography of America was shaped largely by racial terror. A landscape, a legal architecture that codified racial hierarchy continued to shape life in this country. This society, this country, this nation has work to do to fully overcome the history and legacy of slavery. At the Legacy Museum, we believe an important experience awaits each and every person, that there is a journey that must be taken to create a different kind of future. It is hard to confront these painful truths, but the powerful thing is that when we have the courage to learn the truth, we open up doors that permit justice, that permit reckoning, that permit healing. This museum is dedicated to creating a society where the children of our children are no longer burdened by the legacy of slavery, no longer presumed dangerous and guilty, no longer haunted by racial inequality no matter where they go. But to get to that society, we all have a role to play. And that's why we want you to come to Montgomery and not just see the sights, but to hear the sounds, to experience the spirit of the people who lived here, who have fought here, who have worked here, and to take that spirit with you out into the world where you can do the same. You can continue to find ways to advance justice in your society, your community, your neighborhood.
All right, so let me pray, and we'll be done tonight. Lord, we see from your word and studying it that if anyone has reason to fight for justice, if anyone has reason to fight for the equality and the care of all people, it's Christians. It's those who know what it's like, as God said over and over again to his people, you were sojourners, you were slaves, I rescued you, I redeemed you. And so, Lord, we thank you for how you worked redemptively through history, through your people in the Old Testament, and through the coming of Jesus and his bringing of the kingdom of God in a new and way that broke down the barriers of hostility that exist between us, and that historically pushed us forward. And we're thankful for Christians who stood up against slavery, and for Christians who stood up against segregation, and for Christians who fight for justice in our world today. We want to be those Christians. We want to be people who, because of what you say is true, apply these things to our lives and seek to honor you and honor people who are made in your image. And so help us, Lord, as we have opportunity to speak with people, to show them that you're a God of love and justice, that you don't condone these things, and you don't give warrant for them in your word, but rather you are in the process of making all things new. And we look forward to that day when you do so, and when all things will be made new. And we pray that you would be with us as we go through the rest of our week, and until we gather and worship together. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thanks, guys. We're done tonight, done a little early. Always happy to hang around and talk.